I'm Seán Martin. I'm the president of Aquinas Institute of Theology, and ordinarily I restrict my public conversations to matters biblical. I'm a New Testament scholar by training. Occasionally I'll look at the other side of the book, the wisdom literature, or the Torah, or the Psalms, or something, but for the most part, when I am giving especially public addresses, I try to be the cobbler who sticks to his last. But this question about Pope Francis has intrigued me for a really long time, and I'll tell you some stories about Francis as we proceed. But for those of you who are pressed for time, the question here, is the Pope Catholic? The answer is yes. So if you need to go ahead and go, if things at the office or, whatever are calling for you, the answer is yes. The Pope is Catholic. But I want to really reflect upon what Francis is doing to renew the papacy. And just in terms of the thesis that I'm going to entertain with you this afternoon, I think his identity as a member of the Society of Jesus is the framework through which we need to understand his own mission as pontiff of the Roman Church. He likes to use the language of Bishop of Rome. I think you've noticed. And we'll kind of consider that also. But one of the things I just want to introduce to you is obviously this notion that Pope Francis is a pope of firsts. That's that famous picture that was taken when he came out on the loggia right after the cardinal electors had identified him as the next pope. And he did that little, I was watching it, of course, on TV, and he had this sort of little shy wave at the Roman populace that was gathered below in Piazza San Pietro, and he began his discourse with them with "Buonasera," which is like, "Good evening, everybody." It was very unassuming. It was very casual. He certainly didn't use the royal we or any of those kinds of things. You may recall that when he came out on the loggia also, that he asked for the prayers of the Roman people before he would bestow his first blessing as Pope upon the city of Rome, which also was really quite striking. But I just sort of love that photo with the little shy wave and that somewhat, I think, amazed expression on his face that he should find himself in this position. But he is a Pope of first because he's the first Pope from the Southern Hemisphere. He is the first Pope from the New World, from the Americas. Now, granted, of European ancestry. His father was an immigrant to Argentina from Italy. I don't know how well you know Argentina, but there's a significant population of Italian immigrants there. One of my great mentors in biblical studies was an Argentinian of Italian descent named Enrique Nardoni. And Nardoni grew up in Rosario, just sort of up the river from Buenos Aires, speaking Italian at home and speaking Spanish in school. And that was actually the experience of Jorge Bergoglio as well, that he spoke Italian at home and Spanish at school. His mother is also Italian, but the family had immigrated from Italy a couple of generations before. He's the first pope to take the name Francis, which he made very clear afterward that the name was taken in honor of Francis of Assisi. And we all sort of know the ecology of Roman Catholicism. For a Jesuit to take a Franciscan name is striking, we'll put it that way, okay? And of course, he is the first pope from the Society of Jesus. Let me tell you a funny story, and this involves the press. Obviously, this conclave that elected Pope Francis was different, at least in our lifetime, than any other conclave. Pope Benedict had resigned. I'll show you the timeline here in a second. We knew that there would be a conclave. We knew the date of that conclave. So the press was obviously readying itself because the election of a pope is always newsworthy. So in Dallas, Texas, which is not a Catholic town, right? There was a sort of a flurry on the part of the press to be ready for this moment when it happened. And so there's kind of two major newspapers in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the Dallas Morning News and the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. And they called the Chancery office at the Diocese of Dallas and wanted to know who could they talk to about the conclave. And I think this was probably the auxiliary bishop's revenge on me. We've actually were classmates and really good friends. But I think he decided he was going to delegate this job to me. And of course, I was living in St. Louis in 2013. I had moved up here from Dallas in 2002. And so he said, yeah, we've got this guy, he lived in Rome for a long time. He's your contact. Here's his cell phone number. So I get this call from this conference call from one guy over in Fort Worth and one guy over in Dallas. And they want to know, what can I tell them about the conclave? And I'm like, well, I'm not a Vaticanologist. I'm a New Testament professor, but I did live in Rome for a while, and I've been a priest for, at that point, I think it was about 30-something years. Sure, I'd be glad to give you, kind of an orientation to what's going on. I said, here's what I want you to do. When the white smoke is announced and all that, give me 20 minutes, and then, because I figured with Google, I can find out virtually anything, right? Give me about 20 minutes, and then I'll give you background on whoever the new pope was. So the white smoke turns up. Jorge Bergoglio comes out, the dean of the College of Cardinals, Cardinal Turan, introduces him as Franciscus, and of course I'm Googling, and all of a sudden I realize I know this guy, and I'll tell you why or how I know him. But in the meantime, then my cell phone rings, and it's these two hapless reporters, one from Fort Worth and one from Dallas. And I'm explaining to them that this is a really significant choice because he's the first pope from the Southern Hemisphere, that he is the first pope from the Americas, that he is the first pope to take the name Francis, and that he is the first Jesuit. And they're like, hold on, how do you spell that? I'm like, Jesuit. And then this guy from Fort Worth, granted, okay, which is a smaller town than Dallas, said, does that mean he's Catholic? Now, it was a sort of an innocent kind of question in some respects because those of us who grew up Catholic are familiar with the ecology of the Roman Catholic Church. So we know, Dominicans and Franciscans and Jesuits and Holy Cross Fathers and Oblate Fathers and so forth and so on. I mean, we're just familiar with all that. And, we don't have any problem with sort of identifying the distinctions between a Jesuit on the one hand, a Dominican or a Franciscan or an Oblate Father or whatever else, but we kind of take all that for granted. This guy, actually both of them, were sports writers. And I think their familiarity with religion, and especially institutionalized religion, was probably more like, the chaplain that occasionally shows up on the side of the football field or something and might bless a player as he's carried off the field. So the question, is the Pope Catholic? Well, for them, really betrayed a real ignorance around the ecology of the Roman Catholic Church. But as I say, the answer is yes. And I did a quick tutorial on religious communities in the church. And then this guy says to me, well, what religious community do you belong to? And I said, well, I don't. I'm a diocesan priest. And the guy said, are you Catholic? All right, so this is what happens in the 21st century when local newspapers really cut back on their coverage of the religion beat. You just don't have the kind of informed reporting that we used to. But I think in the end they did understand the importance of this election. And a couple of things I want to just note for you here is this timeline. There's a photograph of Francis meeting with Pope Emeritus Benedict. You remember, 5 years ago in February, Pope Benedict announced that he would resign from the papacy. And he announced in Latin, and it was really quite interesting because the lingua franca of the Vatican is Italian. And actually, John Paul II would routinely speak Italian in public. I don't think he ever made a major speech in Latin. And I think a lot of the curial officials certainly are conversant with Latin, but it's more written language than a spoken one. And there is this wonderful photograph, and I looked for it, I couldn't find it, but Benedict is actually reading the announcement of his resignation in Latin, and you see this cardinal off to the side. It suddenly dawns on him what the Pope is actually saying. And he had this sort of both alarmed and alert expression on his face. Okay? But this was the first time in centuries that the Roman pontiff had offered a resignation, and Benedict said that he just didn't think that he had the strength to discharge the duties that were incumbent upon him as Pope. About 2 weeks later, that resignation took effect. And you may well remember, I was glued to the television during those days, that he was airlifted from St. Peter's to Castel Gandolfo in the Castelli Romani, south of the city, and they show him getting off the helicopter and walking into Castel Gandolfo, and Swiss guards close the gates behind him with a thunk, and all of a sudden, he was Pope Emeritus. And then we had the conclave that happened 14 days later. And everyone knew the conclave would start on March the 12th. There were 115 cardinal electors who gathered in Rome to do this, to elect the next pope. The next day, the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, was elected on the 5th ballot, and he took the name Francis. As conclaves go, historically at least, this one was pretty brief. I think most folks expected, given, and I don't know how closely you sort of followed the horse race aspect of that 5 years ago, there was no clear front runner the way that there had been when John Paul II died. The election of Joseph Ratzinger as Pope Benedict XVI surprised no one. Okay? That was not a surprise. He was clearly the favorite, if you will, of the cardinal electors. Though the rumor always was that Bergoglio was pretty high on the list of, papabile, as they say in Italian, of people who are literally able to be poped. That's what papabile means. All of that, of course, is rumor, because the cardinal electors take a blood-curdling oath of confidentiality, not to talk about, who was, in the running, not to talk about even, how they themselves voted. All of that is meant to be almost really the secret of the confessional. The only reason we know that it was the 5th ballot is, of course, remember, they burn the ballots after each one, and these days, it used to be you would add straw, I think, to make it white and something else to make it black. Now they use actual chemicals. So we know that there were 4 times that black smoke came out of that chimney, though sometimes, in a cloudy March day, it's sort of hard to tell what color the smoke is. I mean, maybe the cardinal electors could consider using Twitter or something the next time. I think Twitter would be admirably suited for announcing habamos papam, we have a pope. But that said, we know that it took 5 ballots to elect him. And then, of course, as I say, he's brought out onto the loggia there to greet the Roman people. One of the things that, as I said, I'm going to kind of entertain here as a thesis is that we're able to make sense of who Pope Francis is through the framework of his identity as a member of the Society of Jesus, his Ignatian identity. And just again, another timeline. He's born on December the 17th, 1936, to an Italian immigrant, Mario José Bergoglio, who had himself immigrated from northern Italy, and to a woman of Italian descent, Regina Maria Sivori. She lived till 1981. You'll note that his dad died in 1959, right after the then Jorge Mario Bergoglio entered the Society of Jesus. And there's a lot of other things I could have put up here in terms of his biography, not all of which is relevant. He actually majored in chemistry and worked as a bouncer in a bar. These are college jobs, let's face it. I worked in a donut shop at one point. Is it relevant to my vocation as a priest and as a New Testament scholar? I think not. Though the only thing that I will say working in a donut shop will do to you, it'll put you off donuts for the rest of your life, okay? The rest of your life. I don't know what that did in terms of bouncing for Father Bergoglio, but he does apparently to this day love the tango. But he entered the society as a novice at the age of 22, and then he made his first vows as a Jesuit at the age of 24. And those of you who are familiar with the formation of members of the Society of Jesus know they have a 2-year novitiate, as opposed to a lot of communities that have a 1-year novitiate, and then their formation lasts a very, very, very long time. His did too. He was ordained to the presbyterate at the age of 32, almost 33. He was a couple of days shy of his 33rd birthday when he was ordained as a priest for the Argentine province of the Society of Jesus. Okay? Now, as I say, there's a lot else we could have paid attention to. As a Jesuit, he was a formator and ultimately became provincial of the province of Argentina. And at another point, then he is made auxiliary bishop of Buenos Aires with right of succession, actually coadjutor. And at that point, he becomes, upon the death of his predecessor, he became then the Archbishop of Buenos Aires. But as I say, it's his Ignatian identity that is, from my point of view, so compelling. This is Peter Paul Rubens' portrait of Ignatius. Some of you know I took as a minor art history, so I like pictures, and I particularly like pictures of, from really great painters. That's a remarkable painting by Rubens because it shows, obviously, Ignatius as a priest, but that line of light here that comes, sort of from above is really, I think, meant to signal to the viewer Ignatius's mysticism as well. Okay? How many of you have made, at one point or the other in your life, the spiritual exercises? Yeah, in a Jesuit town like St. Louis, I'm not surprised about that. And in fact, for a long time, we tended to think that the spiritual exercises were meant for clerics. But Ignatius wasn't even a cleric when he devised these spiritual exercises. And he always intended them for believers. And in fact, that's been one of the great gifts of the post-conciliar church, that we've really recovered the importance of the spiritual exercises for everybody, not simply for the ordained ministers of the gospel, much less ordained ministers of the gospel who belong to the Society of Jesus. My thesis is that his spirituality, no surprise, his Christology, his ecclesiology, and that might be a bit of a surprise, are all profoundly Ignatian. And I think we're probably all aware, since so many of you have taken the spiritual exercises, what spirituality is, but perhaps these other terms might be helpful. Christology is simply a sustained reflection on the person and nature of Jesus, right? From my point of view as a New Testament scholar, the Gospels are narrative Christologies. They are sustained reflections on the person and nature of Jesus, but put in story form, right? Today, most people who write Christologies do not write stories. They reflect on those stories, and they write discourses. Ecclesiology, by contrast, is a sustained reflection on the person, or the nature and the mission of the church, ecclesia in Greek. And again, I think we've got narrative ecclesiologies in the New Testament. The Acts of the Apostles, I think in particular, is a kind of a vision of what the church ought to be, but again, in a narrative form. But today, people who write about the nature and the mission of the church write essays, write discourses, okay? Now, as I say here then, his understanding of who Jesus is, his understanding of what the church ought to be, is absolutely rooted in his Ignatian identity. Specifically, and when you read these, the technical term we use are allocutions, speeches that he makes. Sometimes it'll be the homilies that he delivers at Casa Santa Marta, where he now lives. every morning he gets up and he presides at Mass, and he talks a lot about discernment in those homilies. In his encyclical and apostolic exhortations, he oftentimes uses the language of discernment. Right now with this synod on young people and their choice of vocations, discernment is looming large in all of those discussions in Rome. And particularly those of you who have done the spiritual exercises, you know how important discernment is. You know, trying to discover in the concrete circumstances of one's life what God wants us to do, right? I mean, that's really all discernment is. I mean, it's a fairly simple explanation. The process can be fairly involved, right? The discernment of spirits and so forth and so on can be, I mean, really quite, complicated sometimes. But the other thing, this movement toward the periphery, and he speaks a lot about that, is also profoundly Ignatian. Remember that Ignatius founded the Society of Jesus as a missionary order. And the idea was that, these members of the company, these members of the Militia Christi, these soldiers of Christ, would quite literally go to the peripheries of the world. Think of people like Francis Xavier, Matteo Ricci, people like that, who went to the subcontinent, who went to China or Japan, and there sought to evangelize. And they were quite literally moving to the periphery. When Francis talks about moving to the periphery, of course, it also is I guess we could call them sort of maybe the existential peripheries, of life. So that you're going not simply to your comfort zone, but you're moving outside of your comfort zone precisely in order to encounter Christ in the stranger, right? And I find that to be really quite, it's quite telling in some respects in terms of how he understands the mission of the church. There's a little bit of maybe a sociological understanding of the periphery both in France and in Italy, especially the large cities of Italy. What you and I would call the suburbs are there called the periphery. And interesting, let's say for instance a place like Rome, the center city is actually where the wealthy people live, okay? The periphery, which have these huge apartment complexes that the Italians call casettone, which sort of means great big old house. That's how I would translate it into at least Texan English. That's where people of modest and even poverty-stricken lives live, okay? And in fact, in a place like Rome, the social problems that are associated with poverty are found not in the center city, but are found in the periphery. So when Pope Francis talks about moving to the periphery, it is a kind of a geographic metaphor for this preferential option for the poor, which has also been a very important motif in Central and South American Catholic theology, right? So the idea is in Paris, in Rome, in Milano, wherever else the believers are, moving to the periphery is also moving in such a way that we are in service to the poor, to the disenfranchised, to the voiceless, and so forth and so on. Okay? That makes sense to everybody? Right? In some respects, the sociology of European cities is almost exactly the opposite of the sociology and the demographics of American cities. Where American cities, St. Louis is a classic example of that, the peripheries, the suburbs, are comfortable and safe and wealthy and all that, and that it is the center city where we have our social problems. I live in the city of St. Louis. Now, I live in a beautiful neighborhood, Tower Grove South. But I've got friends that live in, Wildwood or Frontenac or whatever, and they'll say, "Oh, Father Seán, we'll find you a safe place out here." Like, I'm pretty safe where I am, thanks. And it's also about a 5-minute commute from my school, and it's hard enough at 5 minutes away for me to arrive at work on time. So, I think I'm going to stay where I am, thanks. Okay, but there is that fear, and it's not unique to St. Louis because I've certainly seen it in Dallas also. But that fear that if you're in the city somehow, that somehow you're in danger, and that the safe place to be is out in the suburbs, right? But that's an American phenomenon. If we were in Rome, the safe place to be would be in the centro storico, the historic center of the city. And if you're out in the periphery, you are encountering, as I say, many of the social problems that are associated with poverty. The focus that I really want to land on right now is Pope Francis's efforts at reforming the Roman Curia. That was his mandate. That seems very clear from all the rumors that we hear from that conclave, that the cardinal electors want a significant reform of the Roman Curia, and I'll explain why that should be so in a moment. But as a kind of a thesis, I want to kind of entertain this one, that his efforts at reforming the Roman Curia are in fact adaptations of Ignatian forms of governance. Okay? That he's using structures that would have been familiar to him in terms of his Jesuit life. But let me stop right here, because this is supposed to be dialogues, right? Let me see if you have questions or comments at this point. Now, I'm going to be quite frank. I'm a fan of Pope Francis. I think he is exactly what the Church needs at this point. But David, go ahead.
Father Seán, I just wanted to add that I think you know that I was stationed in Buenos Aires twice.
Yes.
And Buenos Aires is much like you described European cities, where the rich live in town and
the poor are out in the colonias. Yeah.
And in fact, a lot of South American cities are in a valley.
Yeah.
And as you go up the hills alongside, it gets more and more important until you get to shanty towns.
Yep.
Around the country.
Right. Those colonias or those barrios. Yeah, exactly. I thought there was another hand down there. Yeah.
Just similarly, Father, periphery, you're also making disenfranchised.
Yes. Yes. That, especially in a place like, and I'm most familiar with Rome, somewhat familiar with Paris, but the idea is that if you're living out in these peripheries, that not only are you poor and subject to the kind of depredations of social ills that accompany poverty, but frequently you really literally are disenfranchised. It's where recent immigrants live, and like in a lot of societies, the immigrant has no voice, literally. I mean, cannot vote, is disenfranchised in the strict sense of the term. So again, when Francis is calling for a movement toward the periphery, he's talking about, helping the voiceless find voice, those kinds of things. Yeah, those are all really helpful comments. And David, I'm particularly grateful for that comment about the geography of South American cities. Okay? Yeah, Dolores has got a question over here, Dave.
Well, I've heard criticisms of him because they call him a socialist, but I would say if you have a preferential
Option.
for the poor, how could one not be? And is that a hand in glove thing with his thinking?
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, Francis is a classic 21st century churchman, and that the church has committed itself, it's in, Gaudium et Spes, one of the great constitutions of the Second Vatican Council. We've committed ourselves as a community of faith to service to the poor, to being the voice for the voiceless, to sharing both the hopes and the sorrows of the human race. And I would, I don't like political categories that are visited upon theological realities, because I think those political categories falsify the complexity of the theological reality. But I would say that Francis's emphasis on moving toward the periphery, on his emphasis on discernment and so forth and so on, comes out of his theological convictions, not out of any kind of political stance. In fact, where politics are concerned, actually, he had some real differences with the Kirchners. Both the husband, who was president of Argentina when he was archbishop, and then his wife, who eventually succeeded him as president, they kind of mended fences after Francis was elected pope. But as archbishop, he spoke up, again, in defense of the defenseless and against, exploitation of the voiceless and so forth, but it was out of his theological convictions, not out of any kind of political conviction. So as I say, I'm reticent to even use, the S word or the C word with respect to, any kind of social initiative that arises out of a set of theological convictions, okay? And we do have social initiatives, let's face it. I mean, we're the church. We're not just simply fixing our eyes on some sort of horizon of bliss that God offers to us after death. We're also called to minister to the poor and the hungry and the homeless and the rest of it. Have you all been out to Mercy Center? Out there in Frontenac? I love that place because, it's sort of the chapel is this sort of great drum, and at the top of the drum are this really beautiful stained glass. I don't know whether it was done by Emil Fry and company or not, but it has both the corporal works of mercy and the spiritual works of mercy that are featured in the stained glass. And will it surprise you to know that my favorite spiritual work of mercy is instructing the ignorant? I like that one. I think when the Lord calls me to, accountability, I'll be able to say, well, I might not have been so good about housing the homeless, but by God, I think I did a good job about instructing the ignorant. I taught high school for a number of years after all. Okay, so let's talk about, here we are 5 years later. Okay, where are we in terms of these ensuing 5 years of his pontificate? He's issued 4 major documents. I mean, depending on how you do the counting, because one of them, this first one, Lumen Fidei, that was released in 2013 in June, was really largely the work of Pope Benedict, okay? And it really complemented Benedict's work on hope and on love, right? So that this last was going to be sort of a trilogy on the great cardinal virtues of faith, hope, and love. So we still count it as one of Pope Francis's works because he signed it. But I think most people would say it is largely the work of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Emeritus Benedict. Evangelii Gaudium was issued later on in 2013. That's not technically an encyclical, it's an apostolic exhortation, which means, just from a sort of a canonical point of view, it is less important than an encyclical letter, but I think these days we don't necessarily rank documents, strictly speaking, in terms of their legal status. In many cases, I'll give you an example from the Second Vatican Council. In many cases, the most important documents in Vatican II are what we call dogmatic constitutions, okay, or pastoral constitutions. So that would include the document on divine revelation, it would include the document on the liturgy, it would include the document on the church in the modern world, and it would include the document on the church itself, Lumen Gentium, right? Interestingly, the document on religious freedom was a decree, okay? So in terms of its legal value, it's less important than these great constitutions. And yet, in terms of the after effect that decree on religious freedom has had, it is arguably at least as influential, if not more so, than some of the constitutions, right? Similarly, in my field, we've had some papal encyclicals that are very important for biblical scholars. Pius XII's document on divine revelation called Divino Afflante Spiritu. On the, I think it was the 60th anniversary of Divino Afflante Spiritu, the Pontifical Biblical Commission released a document called The Interpretation of the Bible in the Church. It's a low-level document because it's not even released by a pope, much less a council. It's by a curial office. And yet, because that document was received so positively, its influence is far greater, so to speak, than its legal status. Does that make sense to you? So in the case of Evangelii Gaudium, even though it's an apostolic exhortation and not a papal encyclical, it's still been very important. And at my school, at Aquinas Institute of Theology, since he's talking about evangelization, this thing has really galvanized a number of the members of our faculty, particularly Greg Hiley, who was dean until this past June when he stepped down from being dean, and now he is professor of preaching and evangelization. And I think, I'd have to ask Greg, I think he's virtually memorized Evangelii Gaudium, okay? The joy of the gospel. Laudato Si is an encyclical letter. It's the letter on the care of our common home, his letter on the environment. And again, I think that's been extraordinarily influential. There are study groups kind of all over the nation trying to implement the suggestions that the Pope makes about the care of our common home. And I think the genius of that particular encyclical is that it has made environmentalism not simply a civic duty, but indeed a theological one. Okay? And I mean, it's original, but it's not so breakthrough that we can't understand why this should become a theological issue. If we believe that God is creative, right, and that the world in which we live is in fact a product of God's creative powers, right? We use creation more or less as a synonym for nature, do we not? That then means that the care of creation has theological implications, okay? Because we receive it, as Francis reminds it, as a gift from God himself. All right, does that make sense to everybody? I've got these nieces and nephews who are pretty typical for a lot of college-age kids, are sort of on the edge of ecclesial life, I've got a niece that goes to school at the University of Denver, and I, at one point, was doing what, priest uncles do. And I said, well, honey, have you found a church in Denver yet? And she sort of sighed. She says, no, Uncle Sean, I haven't. And so I was about to suggest that she go to the Dominican church there. It's not too far from the University of Denver. And she said, I'll find it. But let me find it on my own. I'm like, all right, sweetie, whatever. Just do find it, right? But when Laudato Si came out, she actually called me and she says, I like this guy. And I said, the Pope, you mean? And she said, and she's of that generation where, recycling and, anti-littering and all that kind of stuff was really kind of part of their DNA. I remember at one point I was ready to chuck, a bottle of wine just in the trash, and she was probably 7 or 8. She was like, no, Uncle Sean, that goes in recycling, And I was just impressed that she, at 7 years old, was able to pronounce words of, multiple syllables. She's a great kid. All right. Amoris Laetitia came out a little more than 2 years ago, an apostolic exhortation on love and family life. You'll know that it has been, of course, a matter of some controversy within the church, particularly in maybe the question of whether people who are divorced and remarried can still avail themselves of the sacraments. And that's where discernment, of course, is very important within the thought both of this particular apostolic exhortation and then within the thought generally of Pope Francis himself. Frankly, in my reading of Amoris Laetitia, what he says there is no different from what any pastor I know in Dallas or here in St. Louis has often told people, okay? So I think what he's doing is exercising the kind of pastoral oversight that was probably the result of his being a priest for as long as he's been a priest, and especially an archbishop there in Buenos Aires. He's also begun the reform of the Roman Curia by the appointment of this Council of Cardinal Advisors, and that's what I'm going to talk about right now. This Council of Cardinal Advisors, I think, as I'm going to illustrate to you, I think is an adaptation of Ignatian forms of governance. Who are they? The Archbishop of Tegucigalpa in Honduras, Rodriguez Maradiaga, Giuseppe Bertello, the Pontifical Commission for the Vatican City State from Italy, Francisco Javier Errázuriz Osa, the Archbishop Emeritus of Santiago de Chile, Oswald Gracias from India, Reinhard Marx from Munich in Germany, Laurent Monsengwo Passigna from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sean Patrick O'Malley, the Archbishop of Boston here in the United States, and Pietro Parolin, the Cardinal Secretary of State. What do you notice about this group of cardinals? They're from all over. They're from all over. There's geographic diversity here. There's obviously linguistic diversity here. There's, even within the ecology of the Catholic Church, there is theological diversity. I mean, you got a Capuchin, you know, in the person of Sean Patrick O'Malley. You've got a Salesian in the person of Rodriguez Maradiaga. So you've got real diversity here, but I think the most important thing is the geographic diversity of this group of cardinals. Okay? Oh, and George Pell, I didn't go down long enough. He actually has run into his own problems, as you know, in Australia, so he is inactive where this group of 8 is concerned, or group of 9 right now, is concerned. It'll be hard to predict where the Australian judicial system will shake out. He's been accused of being complicit in the sexual abuse of young people by moving priests around, and so there is a judicial process underway right now in Australia. I don't know the Australian legal system well enough to be able to predict what its outcome will be, but he has returned to Australia and is deep, you know, in that process right now. Okay? Now, how is this an adaptation of governance within the Society of Jesus? And I'm cognizant of the irony that I, as president of a Dominican-sponsored theological school, on the edge, granted, on the periphery, if you will, of one of the great Jesuit universities in the United States, and I'm a diocesan priest. And here I am talking about governance in the Society of Jesus, but I was also educated by the Society. So I went a couple of years of high school at a Jesuit school, and then ultimately, of course, my doctorates from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, which was founded by Ignatius Loyola himself as the Roman College. So at least part of my DNA is Jesuit, even though I, you know, work for the Dominicans now, whom I love. Let's just stipulate that right now, okay? And let's, while we're at it, stipulate one other thing. It's the same God, okay? It's the same God who made us all. It's the same God who calls us all to do his will. It's the same God who promises us life eternal. So, you know, there's no need to be, you know, niggling, so to speak, in our distinctions between those who were educated by Dominicans, those who are educated by Jesuits, those who are educated by the Oblate Fathers, or anybody else. Okay? Now, here's what governance looks like. Like a lot of religious communities, the global Jesuit community is divided into provinces. They're geographic regions. We happen, for instance, to live in the central southern province. It's headquartered here in St. Louis, but it includes, I think, all the way south, as far south as Florida, as far west, I think, as Arizona. Ron Mercier is the provincial of the central southern province of the Society of Jesus, and he's referred to, obviously, then as provincial. Okay? But, and this is what's kind of unique about the Society of Jesus as opposed to the Order of Preachers or any other community that I'm aware of, because the Dominicans also have their provinces. Our sponsoring province is headquartered up in Chicago. The provincial is James V. Marchionda. But in the Society of Jesus, provinces are also grouped together in geographic regions that are called assistancies. And the head of that assistancy is called the regional assistant, as you might imagine. So while we've got, I think there are 5 or 6 Jesuit provinces here in the United States, the assistancy is the Canadian U.S. assistancy. And in fact, the regional assistant is Doug Marcoullier, who I think some of you know from his time here in St. Louis. The regional assistants, and this is right out of their own constitutions, are expected to help and support the Father General of the Society in his decision-making. Each regional assistant is responsible for the oral and written communication within the provinces of that assistancy. So in some respects, they're sort of like super provincials, right? Now, I think this is important And you've got this map unfortunately doesn't show up quite well enough here on the map, but here, for instance, is the North American assistancy, and you see it includes the USA and Canada. I think whoever marked the map, it was not me, was probably an American because it says USA and not USA Canada, okay? You know, they're not the 51st state. I know we like to think of them as such, but it is a sovereign nation. And you'll note that there are 2 assistancies in South America. There's, you know, kind of the deep South America and then South and Central America. You've got an assistancy for Western Europe. You've got an assistancy for Southern Europe and so forth and so on, all right? Now, these cardinal advisors then, as I've already, I think, indicated to you, in terms of their geographic diversity, are really modeled after that of the Jesuit assistancies. And they are supposed to help and support Francis as he goes about his work of governing the church. Their primary function up to this point, and it'll be interesting to see if he confides any other duties to this group of cardinals, but their primary function is to reform the Roman Curia, which then raises the question, why do we need to reform the Roman Curia? This is a picture of Pope Francis delivering his annual Christmas address to the Roman Curia. Traditionally, this has been sort of a, you know, warm family kind of thing. Thank you very much for the work you've done to the church. He has turned this into a kind of call to accountability. And I had to crop the photo, but on either side are 2 curial officials who are looking a little tight-lipped, a little grim. Because one of the things that he's done during these Christmas addresses to the Roman Curia is really call them to conversion, okay? And that's where you're going to find some of his stiffest talks against clericalism, against modern forms of Pharisaism and so forth and so on. I mean, he's really looking to convert members of the Curia, okay? At least since Vatican II, and probably before that, but in terms of the, you know, records that I quickly perused, diocesan bishops have been, well, what's the word I want? Yeah, they've complained. They've registered their difficulties with the Roman Curia on a couple of different accounts. That they find that members of the Roman Curia tend to be disrespectful of them as legitimate heads of local churches, right? In other words, the church is not simply the church universal. The church also has a reality that is tangible in a local church. And by local church, we mean diocese or archdiocese. The local church in church teaching is not the parish, okay? The local church is the diocese or the archdiocese. And the bishop or archbishop of that, you know, diocese or archdiocese is a head. You know, he shepherds, he teaches, he sanctifies this local church. Those are his primary duties. And yet, the complaint has oftentimes been that when they come to Rome, these diocesan bishops come to Rome for what's called their ad limina visit. Okay? They go to Rome there to, you know, kind of report. I mean, it is a form of accountability, but what's going on in their diocese or archdiocese, that they're treated by the Roman Curia like branch managers. Okay? That they're not granted, so to speak, the respect that is theirs. The other criticism has been that the Roman Curia is Italianate. Now, that's not being racist or ethnocentric or something. I mean, it's not that it's, you got to speak some language, and the lingua franca of the Vatican is in fact Italian. And at least since the days of Paul VI, it's been considerably more internationalized than it used to be. You have people from all over the world that are working in the Roman Curia, but what we found, and I found this to be true in my years in Rome, that frequently the people from elsewhere, in my case it would be the Americans that I knew, became, as we say, more Roman than the Romans. Okay? There's a phenomenon that's referred to as Romanitas. And if someone is said to be you know, an exemplar of Romanitas, it is generally speaking not a compliment. Okay? At least if it's coming from a diocesan bishop. This Romanitas then tends to be insufficiently appreciative, we'll put it that way, of the global diversity that is Roman Catholicism. And if you've had a chance to travel anywhere else, you know that the church looks very different. When you go to Mexico, or when you go to Africa, if you go to Southeast Asia, really, there's a genius that informs these local churches that doesn't always percolate out or up elsewhere, particularly Rome. The third critique of the Roman Curia is that it's bloated and inefficient. There is a joke that is told, I think it's true, that it's after John the 23rd was elected, and he's kind of one of the first sort of media-savvy popes, and he's walking around with a group of reporters, and somebody said to him, "Holy Father, how many people work here at the Vatican?" And he said, "About half." And it is true, The only people I know that perhaps are possessed of a less stringent work ethic tend to be academics who work in theological colleges with a finely sharpened focus, perhaps in preaching, All right, now, so those are the critiques, that it tends to be disrespectful of local ordinaries, that it tends to be insufficiently appreciative of the global reality of the church, and that it is bloated and inefficient. Every report we have, and so some of this is like gossip, right? Because none of us, at least in this room, were present in the conclave. At one point, somebody gets up and says, "Extra omnes," out everybody. And everybody who's not a cardinal elector has to leave the Sistine Chapel, and after that, we don't know what goes on because of those blood-curdling oaths that these guys have to take. But every report we have is that the cardinal electors wanted somebody who would reform the Roman Curia. Because you will remember in the latter years of the pontificate of Benedict XVI, there was this unseemly soap opera that people referred to as Vatileaks. And it was confidential documents that sort of indicated and documented, really, the infighting that happens in the Roman Curia, and that apparently the Pope's butler was, and this, it sort of sounds like something out of Masterpiece Theater or something, but was smuggling these documents, which were supposed to be shredded, out and then feeding them to some conservative blogger, I think writing for Il Messaggero, one of the Roman newspapers. But in any case, all this gets out, and it shows that the governance of the church is, it's really being exercised by people who are consumed by petty envy and rivalries that really diminish the mission, put it that way. So I think the cardinals were like, we've had enough of this, no more of this. I think at this point, I want to, and at 5 years, might be too soon. I've got a picture of the Sphinx there at Giza because there was a Belgian churchman, Mark, you'll like this. His name was Frédéric François Xavier de Merode. He was a 19th century churchman who said, making reforms in Rome is like cleaning the Egyptian Sphinx with a toothbrush. I guess it can be done. But by the time you're finished, you've got to start all over again, right? And so there's a certain degree of, Francophone cynicism, I suppose, in Archbishop Merode's observation. But it points to the fact that people have been calling for the reform of the Roman Curia for centuries, okay? So to do an assessment at this point of his efforts to reform the Roman Curia, it might be a little premature. But I think what we've got here in this appointment of this group of cardinal advisors is not so much a reform of the Curia per se, but it's a superimposition of another structure on top of it, okay? And I think then the question becomes, is that superimposition, in fact, effective, okay? He certainly called for the internal conversion of those curial officials, as I mentioned before, in that annual Christmas address. But I think the question becomes, and those of you who are experts in organizational development, I think it may be, the same question may be occurring to you, are things like bringing in new structures, creating new structures on top of old ones, or for that matter, simply calling for individual conversions, is that enough to reform an institution? Is that how you turn, a ship around? I have my doubts, I'll put it that way. I'm not an expert in organizational, transformation by any means. I'm a New Testament scholar. I've had to do at my school some degree of reorganization, though we're so small in comparison. It's a matter of simply gathering people around the table and saying, how can we do our jobs better? How can we, share information more effectively? What new systems do we need to put in place? Those are conversations that even in a small school like mine often take time to sort of implement. In our case, it was almost a year before we could put in a new, what we call a student service system that would serve our students in the way that they really deserve to be served. I can't even imagine what kind of reforms you would need to put in place. One thing that, I have suggested, and people do take calls from the president of Aquinas Institute of Theology, which is interesting, is that there ought to be term limits. That in other words, someone who wants to work in one of the dicasteries, that's the term that you use in Rome, for one or another Vatican office, ought to do so for a fixed term of time. 5 years, 8 years, something like that. This is the lesson that I've learned actually from the Dominicans, who have term limits of their own. Michael Mascari, who is here, our dean, is a former provincial of the province of St. Albert the Great. Michael, you served 2 terms of office as provincial. Each of those terms was 4 years, right? 4 years. The brothers elected him in 2003, and then they re-elected him in 2007, and you are only eligible to serve 2 terms in succession. Is that correct? And, now I've got him at Aquinas Institute of Theology, okay? We were really happy when Michael consented to join our faculty as our academic dean because he brings some pretty impressive administrative chops. But there's term limits in that community so that nobody exercises authority for too long. And I think the wisdom behind it is, new people bring new ideas, new perspectives, a new way of doing things. And I think that kind of understanding of term limits could be very easily implemented in the Roman Curia. We have term limits for the most part here in the United States also in terms of our civic government. An individual can only serve as president for 2 terms, right? If, in fact, the electorate sees fit to return that individual to office. So now I've heard, I don't know, and I'll defer to maybe Father Mascari here, I've heard that the founders at least consulted Dominican constitutions. I think, was it Madison they was supposed to have known, or Adams? They say Jefferson. That Jefferson knew something about Dominican constitutions. He was a polymath after all, so it shouldn't probably surprise us. But that the notion of term limits was, inspired, if you will, by the constitutions of the Order of Preachers. I hear that from Dominicans. I don't hear it from Jeffersonian scholars. Let me just say that, okay? All right, so, but I think, just to be fair, 5 years in, might be expecting too much. But I think the term limits would be one of those things that we can do. So because I'm a teacher, I'm going to give you bibliography, right? And isn't that great? That's Francis holding up a book, urging people to read it, okay? Now, the book that he's holding up here is actually a copy of the Scriptures, which cheers my heart considerably, that a pope would urge people to read the Scriptures. It shouldn't surprise anybody, but it's cheerful when you're a New Testament scholar that the head of the church is telling people to read the book, okay? But here's some books to read. John Allen, one of the leading, he's a journalist, but he really does specialize in covering the Catholic Church, wrote a very, very modest, it's a pamphlet more than anything else, called Against the Tide, The Radical Leadership of Pope Francis, published right here in Jeff County, just south of St. Louis at Liguori. This book is really just out, and it is fascinating. And a lot of my insights in terms of the Ignatian DNA, if you will, of Pope Francis, I've been inspired by Massimo Borghese, who writes a book called The Mind of Pope Francis, Jorge Mario Bergoglio's Intellectual Journey. Now, he goes further in also talking about the influence of the theologies of liberation in South America, particularly the bishops' conferences in Merida, in Aparecida, and so forth, that have influenced Bergoglio's thinking when he was an archbishop. Finally, my colleague, our former dean, now professor of preaching and evangelization, Greg Hiley, has written a book called The Preaching of Pope Francis, Missionary Discipleship, and the Ministry of the Word. That came out a little more than 2 years ago from Liturgical Press up in Collegeville, Minnesota. All these are really well written, and I think they shed light on various aspects of Pope Francis's ministry. If you have to choose between the two of them, or the three of them, I would say read Greg's book, because he's my colleague, and I think it'll help pay rent over at his priory. But beyond that, I actually think that Massimo Borghese's book is just really well done, okay, and very comprehensive. So that's what I've got. Let me hear what you've got. What are your thoughts about Francis? Mark, where'd David go?
You mentioned the Archbishop of Belgium, de Merode.
Yes, Merode.
The princes of de Merode were one of the two princely families in Belgium that were insiders in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. So as an utter insider in the complexity of the Holy Roman Empire,
Yeah.
he paints that picture of the Roman Curia,
Yeah.
which tell me that he thought that the Curia was worse than the complexity of the Holy Roman Empire. That was not a compliment.
It was not a compliment. Now, you know what they used to say about the Holy Roman Empire? It is neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. Okay? Mark is the honorary consul from Belgium, so he knows whereof he speaks when it comes to all things Belgian. You grew up in, was it Antwerp? Where did you grow up?
First 8 years of my life, I grew up in Congo.
Oh, Congo, yeah. Forgot about that.
I went there to Jesuit school in Bukavu. That building is still there. Then I went to Antwerp, and the first couple of years of my university, I went to the Jesuit University in Antwerp. So, despite different backgrounds, we're good friends.
The same God made us all. What else? I think we got a question over here, David. Or a comment, observation.
Connect these in any way you want, but a couple of the things that occur to me is the reform really might not take hold in terms of our church without addressing the overriding elephant in the room, which is clericalism,
Yep.
I think, and the ultra Catholic right in our country anyway, that seems to be about anybody who doesn't toe their line is not Catholic, and therefore, is he Catholic? They would say no.
Right.
But that rampant stuff, and then the Pagano and all that type of stuff going on. Could you just give some thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly Francis has spoken out in no uncertain terms about clericalism. And, that can be a word that covers a multitude of sins. Okay, I think we need to be clear about that. But it would certainly be, I think in Francis's understanding, clericalism would be any claim to power, okay, within the church. And Francis understands the church as being a community of service. Service to God, of course, service to humanity, particularly the most vulnerable members of the human family. So, clericalism for him would be a kind of an inversion of priorities that the church, and particularly leaders of the church, ought really to have. So, as I say, he calls for that kind of conversion. I mean, and I'm using the term conversion in, I think, exactly the same way that Ignatius uses it in the Exercises, which is to say that it is a way of reorienting one's energies, reorienting one's attitudes in the service of the gospel, in the service of God, okay? Which involves self-abandonment, self-emptying, I mean, all those kinds of things, Think of the Shushipiat, take, Lord, all I have, my memory, my understanding, my entire will, and so forth. That would be the ideal for Francis. The truth is, yes, there have been, there's a cadre of people that have objected to what he's been doing from the very beginning. And I think it's because, well, of all the theological concepts that Roman Catholic theologians fool around with, the one that is most susceptible to empirical verification is original sin, okay? And the history of the Jesus story, if nothing else, indicates that a good human being can ask people to reform their lives, and they can respond in ways that are violent and hurtful. That's the crucifixion, right? And I think that you've got some people that would, like to discredit Pope Francis in any way they can, precisely because, of this mysterium iniquitatis, this mystery of evil. That said, on the other hand, it's a big church, and there are going to be differences in opinion about what is the best way to go forward. I think, there are some significant differences between Benedict on the one hand and Francis on the other, I think particularly where ecclesiology is concerned. I think you may well remember that Benedict was said at one point to have wanted a smaller, purer church. He was reflecting on especially the church in Europe, where its cultural hegemony could no longer be taken for granted, and that people were in fact objecting to a kind of a state church, or what's the term they use in England, an established church. That kind of thing in fact worked against missionary discipleship. And so that Benedict anticipated a day when the church would be actually smaller than it is. Francis does not want a smaller, purer church. I think Francis's idea of the church is summed up in James Joyce's observation when he was asked, what is the church? Here comes everybody, and that the church is, to use Francis's, one of his favorite images, is a field hospital. It's a place where the wounded, it's a place where the hurting, it's a place where the vulnerable are given a place and allowed in some respects to recover from the slings and barbs of outrageous fortune. I think the real problem that Francis is going to face is that a number of people that have suffered the slings and barbs of outrageous fortune have suffered them at the hands of the church, and that is going to be really the biggest challenge. And if anything will derail the effort at reforming the Roman Curia, it's going to be the scandal of sexual abuse, which at this point now has reached into the highest levels of the hierarchy. I think that's going to be his biggest challenge. And I think, granted, I'm a New Testament scholar, take this for what it's worth, but I think that his pontificate will probably be judged by the success with which he will have addressed this issue of sexual abuse. Cover-ups, all that kind of stuff, simply are not going to do anymore. If they never did. But particularly in a Me Too world, particularly in a world with a 24-hour news cycle, particularly in a world where everybody's got a Twitter account. I don't, by the way, but news like this spreads literally like wildfire. And how do you create a community in which vulnerable people are safe, and where the gospel is preached with integrity. You know, I mean, on the one hand, it shouldn't be that hard, right? But on the other hand, at least in the South and Southwest, we've been dealing with this. Has been the issue that's defined the entirety of my priestly ministry, because those stories started to break in Louisiana in the early 80s, and I was ordained in 81. And you know, we've been dealing with it in Texas since then. The national narrative, of course, is that sexual abuse broke, you know, when all that stuff in Boston was revealed, but that's just because it's a big media market. In places like Dallas or Waxahachie or, you know, Lufkin or places like that, we've been dealing with this for a really long time. Does that help? I mean, that make sense to you? Yeah, sure. You got a microphone behind you.
Sorry. Does the comments, particularly how he's going to be judged in the slowing of the potential reform of the curia, does any of that have any impact, particularly the fact that clericalism and how he's talked about that, is that filtering down at all? Let's just use the United States to the seminaries in terms of the future diaconate or the future priesthood at all?
It may be too early to tell. There was all this talk initially, you know, 5 years ago about the Francis effect. And, you know, I think in terms of people in the pew, I don't want to speak for people in the pew because I'm up there in the sanctuary, you know, for the most part. But I think of my brother-in-law who's Jewish and who loves Francis. I mean, inevitably, when I have a conversation with my brother-in-law, I talk to him, you know, once a week or so. You know, he brings me up to date on the latest wonderful thing that he sees in Pope Francis. There's certainly been, I think, for, you know, people in the pew, a kind of refreshing sense of, you know, joy in Francis. He's plain spoken. You know, he doesn't want to live in the Apostolic Palace. He lives in Casa Santa Marta, which is sort of like an embassy suites. I mean, it's a great place, but, you know, it's not as though there are Raffaellos on the ceiling and Peter Paul Rubens, you know, around every corner. I mean, it really is. It's like an embassy suites. It's pretty functional. But people like that. Now, I think it's too early to tell where future priests are concerned whether we're going to have men who define themselves as Pope Francis priests in the same way that we had men in the seminaries that called themselves John Paul II priests, you know? But then John Paul II had a very, very, very long pontificate. And I remember when he died, and I still have contacts in Rome that I keep up with, you know, it's because they're friends, and we all, you know, took grueling seminars in, you know, Ugaritic together or whatever. And this one guy teaches at the Lateran University, which is the Pope's own school, and after John Paul had died, I called him and I said, so, you know, what do you think? And he said, well, we Italians have a saying, after a fat pope, a thin one, you know, which means that after you have a pope with a really long pontificate, then you have a pope with a shorter one. And then he said, because he's very diplomatic, and he said, everyone, he says to me in his sort of beautiful northern Italian accent, everyone loved Pope John Paul II, but we will have no more long pontificates. There must be term limits. He said, and the best term limit is old age. And, you know, that's actually happened in these last two elections since the death of John Paul II. We've elected, you know, guys who are geriatric. Back here. Oh, absolutely. I pray for him and his one lung, you know, every day. He actually had the lung removed. He had a cyst and some kind of upper respiratory infection. When he was a young man, he's actually got like 1 3/4 lungs. I do think, yes, given an agenda that he has that I am perfectly sympathetic with, right? I'd like for him to, you know, live long and prosper, as we say on Star Trek, right? But you know, these decisions are in the hands of God. not in the president of a small, albeit really fine, theological school in St. Louis, Missouri. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I could not agree more. And in fact, that's been one of the geniuses of Roman Catholicism in general, but the Society of Jesus in particular, is this commitment to finding God in all things, and particularly for fostering both the arts and the sciences. I think you know that the Pope's chief astronomer is a Jesuit brother. Runs this wonderful observatory south of the city of Rome, and has actually made some pretty significant contributions to the field of astrophysics. But I think that's another one of the things that I enjoy about, frankly, being Catholic in the 20th and 21st century, is that we have rediscovered, so to speak, the broad generosity of our intellectual traditions, that learning from every single arena of human endeavor is somehow contributes to our understanding of who we are, who God is, and what we should do in response to what God has done for us. So yeah, thank you for that. One more over here, Mark.
Reaching back or going forward, Pope
I wonder if that's on.
Pope John the 23rd triggered and or was part of the big changes in that time of year, that time of the century, with baby boomers, decolonization, just name it. John Paul II led or was part of big changes with the end of the Soviet Union.
Right.
The start of the development of developing countries joining the world economy. So those were giants.
Yep.
Now we have Pope Francis, and it's pretty obvious that in the current world there are things happening that will give us a world that is different 20 years from now. And it's too early to assess whether that has to play on gender, whether that plays on economic relations, whether the battle between world powers will play in that. There's high uncertainty. And maybe you don't know the answer to that question. Can Pope Francis handle today just like John the 23rd
Right.
and John Paul II handled their time?
Yeah, that's a huge question mark, and I don't know that I'd be able to give the definitive answer here by any means. A couple of things, it probably depends upon the issue. But if we're talking about, let's say, the understanding that the world is not simply Western Europe and North America. It's not simply that North Atlantic alliance. That the world includes the Southern Cone, that it includes the subcontinent, that it includes sub-Saharan Africa, and that these are vital places, whether we're talking about the church, whether we're talking about economies, whether we're talking about human inventiveness or whatever else. It does seem to me that Francis is probably equipped by virtue of his own background as a South American, but also by virtue of his Ignatian identity that seeks, so to speak, God in all things, particularly out in the periphery, that I think he would be quick to recognize the potential that is represented by these trends, we'll put it that way. But again, I want to be intellectually modest here, and you can write about that in your diary, that you actually saw me be intellectually modest, but I'm a New Testament scholar, I mean, that's the world that I spent a lot of time thinking about. And of course, their challenges were sort of similar. This religious movement that began in Galilee and Judea, within a very short time, became a worldwide movement and interacted with cultures, was transformed by these cultures, but in turn also transformed the cultures of which it was a part. And the guy who was the subject of a lot of my scholarly work, Paul of Tarsus, was instrumental in all of that. And sometimes all it takes is one person. A Paul, a John the 23rd, a Carol Wojtyla, John Paul II, and maybe also Jorge Mario Bergoglio, Pope Francis. Sometimes that's all it takes. Well, I think it's probably time to adjourn at this point. Thank you so much for coming out today. Our next speaker, and I don't have the date with me, unfortunately, but will feature Greg Hiley, our Director of Evangelization and Preaching, and Diane, who just keeps track of all my goings-on, is now bringing that to me. He is, his thing will be on Tuesday, November the 27th, Count Me In, Becoming a Prepared Listener for Preaching. Greg has been leading our preaching efforts, I think, for now almost 25 years at Aquinas. So I think you're going to find him to be a really interesting speaker who knows whereof he speaks. So I hope to see you on Tuesday, the 27th, and I'll be here. Hope you will too. Thank you for coming.